It's Wednesday, the 16th of June, 2021. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Sean Aylmer. Australia and Britain sign a free trade deal which will open up the world's fifth largest economy to local farmers. That's our main story. Also coming up in today's podcast, the share market hits a record high, as do the stock prices of some of the largest companies on the bourse. The average house price in Sydney tops $1 million, and BHP is sued for allegedly discriminating against men. Immediately after the podcast, stay listening for my chat to the boss of the Rural Bank about lending to the agricultural sector. But first, here's a brief look at markets. Wall Street was lower ahead of a Federal Open Market Committee decision on interest rates tonight. Both the Dow Jones Industrial Average and S&P 500 were 0.2% lower in afternoon trading, while the Nasdaq was off 0.7%. London's FTSE rose 0.4%, leading European markets higher. The Stoxx Europe 600 ended up 0.2% and has now risen for 8 consecutive sessions. That's the longest streak in more than 2 years. The S&P ASX 200 hit a new intraday high of 7,399 points yesterday. It dropped back a bit later in the day to finish at a new closing high of 7,380 points. That was up almost 1% on the day, and all 11 sectors of the market rose, led by healthcare and technology stocks. Index leader, the Commonwealth Bank, closed up more than 2% to $103.45 a share, a new record. Australia's largest company now has a market capitalisation of almost $180 billion. Both Wesfarmers and Woolworths, both top 10 companies, also hit new records. In fact, the number of records set was large and diverse yesterday and included building materials company James Hardie, hearing implant group Cochlear, miner Mineral Resources, retailer Premier Investments, Domino's Pizza and fund manager Perpetual. The top performer on the S&P ASX 200 yesterday was medical technology company ResMed. One of its major rivals announced it would be voluntarily recalling a device for treating sleep apnea. Bad news for that company, but good news for ResMed, and its share price closed up almost 7%. It too hit a new record. Oil prices are up overnight, while gold prices were lower, and the Aussie dollar is trading at 76.8 US cents. Tariffs on Australian farm exports to the United Kingdom will be phased out over a decade, and working restrictions between the two countries relaxed under a free trade deal signed between Prime Minister Scott Morrison and his British counterpart Boris Johnson. The deal, the first for Britain since leaving the European Union, means Australia will get much greater access to the world's fifth largest economy. Mr Morrison called it the most comprehensive and ambitious agreement that Australia has concluded. While many details are still to be sorted, tariffs of up to 80% on lamb will be removed over the next decade. It's a similar story for beef, though in both cases, if the amount of product exported to Britain surges, then tariffs may remain for a further 5 years. Tariffs on Australian dairy products will be eliminated after 5 years, sugar tariffs will phase out, and rice exports to the UK will be tariff-free immediately. The age limit for working visas will be lifted to 35 years. Seasonal agricultural visas will be offered to workers in both countries. Trade between the two countries is currently worth around $37 billion. This is likely to increase, though the in-principle agreement still needs to be ratified by both parliaments. The deal in the short term is as much symbolic as financial. Mr Morrison now heads to Paris to meet French President Emmanuel Macron. Australia is also negotiating an FTA with France, though that has a long way to go. The Prime Minister is certainly making the most of his trip to Europe. In a moment, the rest of the news you need to know this morning. In overseas news, retail sales in the US fell 1.3% last month, much more than anticipated. The data came ahead of the US Fed discussing interest rates tonight and President Joe Biden having his first face-to-face meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Beijing has warned that it won't sit back if directly challenged by the West. Following a communique from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization on Monday night saying China posed a systemic challenge, Beijing refuted the statement. A foreign ministry spokesperson said the US was very ill. And Americans gave a record $471 billion to charities last year, 4% higher than a year before. About 70% of the money came from individuals, according to Giving USA. Among the biggest donors were Mackenzie Scott, former wife of Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, who gave away $6 billion last year and another $2.7 billion so far this year, and Twitter founder Jack Dorsey. Locally, the Reserve Bank board minutes from its June board meeting were released yesterday and showed that the central bank was steadfast in its belief that the official cash rate won't rise until 2024. The board said it was committed to doing what it could to support the Australian economy and would maintain supportive monetary conditions until its goal for employment and inflation were achieved. The RBA said the pickup globally was uneven, and in Australia the economy was stronger than expected, though inflation and wage pressures remained subdued. However, the bank indicated it would be more flexible in its government bond buying program. It didn't say it would pull back, but it is opening the way for changes to the current program of around $5 billion in weekly purchases of bonds. Governor Philip Lowe speaks tomorrow, and investors will be watching closely for hints of any change to the program. The total value of residential dwellings in Australia was close to $8.3 trillion during the March quarter after a surge in house prices. The mean price of a home in Australia is now $779,000, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. New South Wales accounts for 40% of the value of housing across the country, with a 6.2% jump in prices during the quarter. The average price of a residential dwelling in that state is now more than $1 million. BHP is being sued by a former male employee who was earmarked as a future leader, but who kept missing out on jobs to female applicants. The man, Burak Powers, has alleged a systemic pattern of top-down sex discrimination in a US lawsuit, according to the Financial Review. BHP, which aims to have women comprising 50% of its workforce by 2025, said it will defend the suit. Mr. Powers was part of BHP's Future Emerging Leaders program and claims he missed out on 3 jobs in which he was clearly better qualified. The claim argues that Mr. Powers missed getting the jobs as a direct consequence of BHP's strategy to increase females in its workforce. The Australian government is offering around 80,000 square kilometres in offshore waters to oil and gas explorers as part of its efforts to improve fuel security and advance the gas-led economic recovery. The blocks are in basins off Western Australia, Victoria and Tasmania, and are generally in areas with proven oil and gas reserves and infrastructure. Bids for the blocks are due next March, though it's not certain that there'll be a rush given the global push away from developing new oil and gas fields. The New South Wales government will set aside $1 billion to develop a third CBD in the Western Sydney suburb of Bradfield. The announcement will come in next week's state budget, which will also include changes to stamp duty. Also, Premier Gladys Berejiklian said she had met with the Pharmacists Guild to explore expansion of the rollout of vaccines, and the state was waiting for federal approval to go ahead with its plan to allow 250 international students to return each week. There were no new cases of COVID-19 reported in Victoria yesterday morning, the first time that's happened in 3 weeks, but the good news came with a warning. The number of daily COVID tests tumbled on Monday, the Queen's birthday long weekend. Testing continued throughout the day, and by the afternoon at least 2 new community-transmitted cases had been detected, though they won't appear in the official figures until today. It came as Victorian Health Minister Martin Foley said there wasn't enough Pfizer vaccines to meet demand in the state. Queensland budget papers show that coal royalties tumbled this financial year and were expected to be 50% lower than a year earlier, but the budget is expected to return to surplus in 4 years' time. The reason for the fall in royalties was the informal ban of Queensland coal imports into China. While demand from South Korea and Japan was rising, China was still problematic, and Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk said she'd like to see an improvement in the relationship between Canberra and Beijing. She was joined by West Australian Premier Mark McGowan, who said it was time for a national reset with China, and the Morrison government needed to cut back its rhetoric. He said it was in the best interests of Australia's security and economy to have a good relationship with China. The number of overseas travellers entering Australia in April was almost 8 times the level of March, thanks to the New Zealand travel bubble. The Australian Bureau of Statistics figures showed 22,610 arrivals during April, still well below normal levels. Oaktree Capital has revised its offer to buy out James Packer's stake in Crown Resorts. In April, Oaktree offered to fund a $3 billion buyout of some or all of Mr. Packer's stake. Mr. Packer's influence on Crown was one of the reasons the group didn't get a gaming licence in New South Wales following the Bergen inquiry. Buying out Mr. Packer was an option to ease the way for a licence, although since the inquiry, the billionaire has agreed to not influence the operations of Crown apart from voting his stake in any corporate activity. Yesterday's announcement said the Oaktree offer was for a $2 billion loan to Crown to buy out some of Mr. Packer's interests and a $1.1 billion loan that converts into Crown shares to buy out the rest. If the deal was done, and there's no indication it will be, Oaktree will end up with 9.9% of the company. The CEO and CFO of Newey, last year's largest initial public offering, will leave the business after shareholder backlash over the group's inability to meet prospectus forecasts from just 6 months ago. Chief Executive Rod Vaudrey will remain in the position until the group's earnings announcement in August, while Chief Financial Officer Stephen Doyle will leave immediately. Shareholders will hope the changes mark an end to the saga of underperformance by the intelligence software group. Its share price jumped more than 4% yesterday. Network 10 has won broadcast rights to Australia's international soccer games, which are currently broadcast on Foxtel, after paying $100 million. 10's owner, Viacom CBS, will pay the amount over 3 years to show all Socceroos and Matilda internationals and friendlies, Asian Cup qualifiers and World Cup qualifiers. Last month, Viacom CBS signed a $200 million deal to broadcast the A-League and W-League fixtures. And the Australian Club in Sydney, one of the most elite clubs in the city, has voted against allowing women to become members. The Australian Club was founded in 1838 and its members include Malcolm Turnbull, John Howard, Cardinal George Pell and James Packer. Members voted on a special resolution yesterday morning to allow women, but couldn't get the 75% of votes required. Media reports suggested more than 1/3 of members voted against the resolution. It's so ridiculous, it's laughable. Let's hope the 2/3 that voted for admission of women now resign their membership. Bet they won't. After this episode is the Fear and Greed Daily interview, and it's well worth a listen. My guest today is Alexandra Gartman, the Chief Executive of Rural Bank. Rural Bank is part of the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank Group, and as the name suggests, focuses on financing farms and investments right across the agricultural sector. It's a really interesting chat about how farmers are coping post-pandemic, how the bank lends in a sector so heavily influenced by the elements, and also how the value of rural land has shot up in the last 12 months. That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist. It's Wednesday, the 16th of June, 2021. I'm Sean Aylmer, and that was Fear and Greed. Enjoy your day.